presentation today on kind of Trans 101, ranging from things like what it means to be trans, gender norms, and very importantly, how to support trans people. This is going to kind of kick off, in a way, a series of trainings we're going to do around cultural competency topics. We have one in the works that's going to be an anti-racism training. We've been talking to ASAN about doing a training on cognitive disabilities and autism. Want to do a larger kind of Lgbtq training, and I also have gotten requests to do a cultural competency training around mental illness, which we don't have in the works yet, but would like to do some point relatively, soon. So for today, though, it's Trans 101. I also want to make sure people aren't thinking, I think this is a really important topic, not just for folks that see clients. We have the opportunity to interact with people that identify as trans through vendor relationships, funder relationships, community partners, our actual community organizers. So I think this topic touches every one of us in this room. So I'm excited to introduce Nicholas Bear Bade, who prefers to go by Bear, and came recommended by Scott.
Okay, so first, mic check. Can everybody hear me okay through the room? Kinda? Turn it up. Do I need to speak more? Okay, cool. I'll try to remember that. It's always, people always kind of wander, I'm Bear. I'm gonna try to keep things pretty condensed. Nobody likes to get lectured for more than half an hour, 40 minutes or so. So I'll go through kind of what I have written for you, and then we'll open up for Q&A. I didn't really make this specifically for training in the office space. I just kind of geared it towards education. So I touch on a little stuff as far as work or whatever later is in the how to support trans people topic. So yeah, I am a 38-year-old transgender male. I lived the first 34 years of my life as female. I was assigned female at birth, and I'll get into the verbiage around that. When I was 34, I finally kind of accepted the fact that I wasn't just gender non-conforming, but rather that I identified as male. It took a lot of soul searching to decide that I would be more comfortable living as male as opposed to just gender non-conforming female, stuff like that. So in 2014, I came out and started testosterone. I changed my name legally in March of 2015, had top surgery in June of 2015, and have just kind of hit the ground running from there and have just lived as male. It's sort of I almost forget sometimes that I'm actually transgender, because you just go about living your life until something comes along and reminds you. So yeah, we'll get into it. So I do have some topics that I want to cover. I did kind of get rid of the gender norms topic as things were getting a little bit too long. So it changed a little bit. But so first things first, a little Latin lesson to start our day, right at 10 o'clock in the morning. Trans versus cis, okay? I see a lot of people complaining on the internet about all these new terms, and I wanted to address that right away because it drives me a little bit crazy. Trans, the prefix, and cis, the prefix, are Latin-based. So trans is a Latin-derived prefix, means across, beyond, changing thoroughly. Examples are transcend, transfix, and transition. In the case of being transgender, and this is one of my favorite things, I found this very early on as I was researching, the definition of being transgender, it is an adjective, and it denotes or relates to a person whose gender identity does not conform unambiguously to their sex at birth or to the conventional notions of being female or male. And we'll get back to that kind of later. As far as trans being an adjective, the proper way to use it is to say transgender person, trans male, trans female. So I'm a trans male, by the way. You always refer to the person by their preferred gender as opposed to the one that they came from. Okay, so if somebody has transitioned to female, you would say trans female, or just female, and some people prefer either way. Being trans is incredibly like individual. Everybody does it different. So you would never say a trans, a transgender, transgenders, right? Like, it's just kind of like, it's not really offensive, but it's just like bad grammar, which is inherently offensive. Likewise, nobody is ever transgendered. It is not an action, it's not a verb, and it is not something that happened to me. This isn't like an affliction, okay? So, in the interest of education, avoid those words, like a-trans, transgenders, and they're really, really common. Now that I put it on your like radar, you'll see it like everywhere, and it drives me crazy. So cis is also a Latin-derived prefix. Cis means on this side of, and if you try to look it up, you'll get like a bunch of scientific words relating to like chemistry and biology. It is way less commonplace than trans, as far as like transmission, right? If you look it up, you'll see words like cismarine, which means like on this side of the sea. So it's not as commonplace, but it is a way of referring to a person who relates to their birth sex, their assigned sex, without like conflict. So you'll see a lot of like cisgender, you'll see like cis male, stuff like that. So they're not new words. They're just something that's like becoming more on our like radar. So in the case of gender, cisgender is somebody whose identity aligns with their anatomical sex, right? So let's talk about sex. Sex specifically versus gender. To put it really simply, sex refers to your body parts and specifically to your genitals. And we tend to think that there are only two versions of this, the penis and the vagina. By the way, I hope nobody's like weirded out by like these words or anything like that. We're not gonna get into like nitty-gritty or anything like that. But what many people fail to consider is that there are also intersex conditions where a person might be born with like both sets, whether externally or one external, one internal. There are dozens of different intersex combinations that a person might be born with. But more importantly, sex is how we assign babies and therefore people a gender. A doctor will look at an ultrasound or at the newborn baby, and they look there, and they declare your sex and therefore your gender. And from this moment, whether it's at birth or the ultrasound, we start to treat children a certain way. And I think that that's something that we really need to become aware of. Specifically, like, you know, gender reveal parties, which, anyway. But like, newborn photos, you know, like, they tend to be incredibly gendered. You know, so like the little girls are pictured like with like ribbons in their hairs and little skirts like attached to their onesies. Little boys are often like photographed with sports gear and stuff like that. But more specifically, we start to treat that child a certain way. You know, girls are expected to play with certain things. We refer to them a certain way. We'll say sweetheart to a little girl. You know, we'll call little boys like, you know, sport or champ and stuff like that. And they're expected to act a certain way even as little kids, you know. In the case of intersex babies, and I really wanted to talk about intersex today, 'cause it's something I haven't really addressed too much, and I think that we need to be more aware of it. Assigning a gender is way more complicated, and it's not what I went through, so I can't speak about it too much, but I've done some research and I've talked to some people. So basically, if there's ambiguous sex traits, basically like you just sort of pick the one that's like more prominent, and they'll raise their child that way. They assign them that gender. There may be testing, like chromosomal testing, stuff like that. And even more importantly, a lot of times children will be subjected to surgeries way before they can consent to that. And it just causes both assigning the gender and kind of forcing them into it, or doing any of these kind of surgeries. They can lead to serious difficulties later on in life, both physically, emotionally, mentally. And so intersex people kind of tend to be on that trans spectrum. You know, if they were forced to live as male, but they really identify more as female, you know. So they are inherently similar to us, although maybe genetically, chromosomally different. So, having talked about sex, all right, that being your body, your biology, we'll get into gender. Gender is a little bit harder to kind of pinpoint. Gender is your identity, and it's really hard to kind of define that, like define your identity. You know, it's actually something that a lot of people don't even really think about. You don't spend a lot of time thinking about your identity, right? You just kind of like, this is my personality, I go through my day, you know? So scientifically we know that now that the two are different. Gender exists in your brain, and sex is your body. And it's a really hard thing to kind of pinpoint and talk about. Gender is not just how the world perceives you, but how you perceive the world and how you perceive yourself. So it's hard to explain to people like what it means to be transgender, you know, and how the gender identity in the brain works. For the majority of people though, the two align. For various reasons, it's really hard to do research on the number of trans people in the world, but the rough guess is that it's about or less than 1% of the population. So definitely it is considered the norm to, you know, be assigned a gender and to be comfortable with that gender. So, yeah, that's the difference between the two. So, that being said, getting into what it means to be transgender, we'll talk about the different ways of being transgender. So we talk about this as the trans spectrum. Like I mentioned earlier, trans means across from or on the other side of, if you look at it from the Latin. But I also mentioned that being trans simply means not identifying wholly with your assigned gender. So picture gender as a spectrum, okay? On one side you have 100% male, and on the other side 100% female. All right, those are known as binary points. And you'll hear people saying, I'm a binary, you know, male, I'm a binary trans person. That's what that means, okay? As soon as you start to get away from those 2 points on the opposite ends of the spectrum, you are talking about like an infinite number of non-binary points, all right? And somebody could be just slightly away from their assigned gender, where maybe they just like to wear like nail polish or feel a little bit more feminine in the case of someone assigned male. They could be way drastically on the other side. Anywhere in between those 2 points is where a lot of people choose to use the label non-binary, right? Because you have the 2 binary points, right? And they don't fit with either one of them. There are other labels that I've heard, and like I said, you have an infinite number of points between the two, and so choosing one label is really kind of difficult. But some people just like different words more, so some people will say like non-binary, some people will choose to use something else. Again, that's not my identity, so I can't really speak towards that, but I wanted to put it on your radar, because non-binary people get a lot of flack, like for being like not trans enough. Because they don't want to do what I did, which is like this whole transition from one to the other. So they get a lot of crap, and I think it's crap. So yeah, in general though, some non-binary people will choose to use a gender-neutral pronoun like they, them, and some will use other pronouns. I've heard like z, them, you know, stuff like that. And there are a ton of them, and it's just basically like personal choice. I don't know a huge amount of that, and I didn't want to get too far into it. Again, just wanted to put that on your radar in case you meet somebody who says like, I'm non-binary, so you know how to kind of like move forward with that conversation. As far as the trans spectrum goes, there are also people whose identity will flex and change, and that's known as being gender fluid. So on one day, they might want to look more masculine. You know, they might want to present more masculine, be treated more masculine. On other days, they might really swing the other way and be more feminine. And then there's people that don't identify with a gender at all, and that's known as being agender. So again, not my stories, just wanted to put that out there. Personally, I'm a binary trans male. I was assigned female at birth and was never comfortable expressing as female. I remember being a little child and not wanting to wear dresses and headbands. I wanted to play with boys. And I got bullied as a child. I got bullied by teachers and religious leaders and other kids, being told things like, don't sit that way, that's not how girls sit, don't act like a boy. I remember being lectured on how I didn't walk properly because I didn't do that hip sway. Well, I was emulating the people that I respected. They didn't walk that way, they didn't dress that way. So I was going with my perception of the world, again, that being kind of like leading to your identity. So again, I'm a trans male. Another label for me would be FTM, which stands for female to male. And MTF would be male to female, or a trans woman. I like that. I like that title, FTM. A lot of trans people don't. So in the interest of you guys moving forward and dealing with other people, it's always best just to ask, what title do you like? And I'll get more into that later. The reason that some people don't like it though, is that it mentions their birth sex. And a lot of us just will say, well, I never identified as that birth sex, so don't put that label on me in some way. I like it. Again, I like talking about this stuff. I'm really open, so I like being called FTM or trans male. And my pronouns are he, him. So, pronouns. Why they're important and how to ask somebody first. Pronouns are deeply important to us. We assign them to almost everything. Like, think about this for a second, right? Your dog, which, it does have a gender, right? But if somebody says she's so cute, you'll be like, he, right? Yeah. It's really important to us that that's your boy dog, right? Your car. How many people have gendered or named their car, right? Okay. Robotics. And we will build robotics different ways too. Just keep an eye out for this stuff now that I'm talking about it. Pay attention to how often something is gendered but is totally not anatomical. But they're part of how we give people information about ourselves and others. So we will introduce somebody with a title and with a pronoun. Similarly, it's really important to respect someone's pronouns. When someone misgenders you or calls you the wrong pronouns, it sends a really painful message. It tells the person you don't respect them enough to use the correct pronoun, or that you don't perceive them in the way they identify and wish to present. So I will occasionally still get misgendered by somebody who has known me for years and years, and it puts me into a tailspin. In the moment I'm really gregarious and I'll say is the mustache not working for you, or whatever, and I'll kind of make a joke out of it, but I'll do that to kind of bring it to their attention because I think it should be. I'm not the kind of person that just sort of I got misgendered and I don't say anything. No, I'm going to correct them. But later that day, I'll kind of replay that moment in my mind, and the next day and stuff like that, and I'll just be like, man, is it not enough? Is it not enough that I've gone through hormone therapy? I have to do an injection once a week. I had major surgery. I've gone through this whole process of talking to people and, all of these things. Is it not enough? And then furthermore, it gets into your brain, am I just playing make-believe? So this is kind of like a millennial word, but it's invalidating. It really invalidates you when somebody misgenders you, and as much as I can play it off in the moment, it sinks in somewhere, and it hurts. So it sends a really, really difficult message to somebody. As far as how to ask someone's pronouns, this also isn't a quick, easy answer because everybody reacts to things differently. But you can somewhat assume how somebody wants to be referred to by how they present. I'm wearing a tie, and stuff like that. So you can kind of guess, I identify as male. And you can pretty much feel comfortable saying he, him. You might meet somebody though who it's pretty clear that they were assigned female, but they're dressed similarly to me. So that's where it gets a little bit more ambiguous, and you don't know whether to use she, her, they, them, skip straight to he. You know, some people will actually get offended because they choose to present masculinely, but then they get called he, and they're like, you know. So how do you ask someone's pronouns? Because it's incredibly important, right? Just ask permission. That's really the best way. Don't skip straight to, you know, calling somebody something if it's ambiguous. Best way to approach any kind of conversation is to ask permission. You know, and that's like not even just as far as gender, that's, can I tell you about your TPS report? You know, can I give you feedback on that? Is this a good time? You know, you're asking permission. So same thing with somebody's pronouns. Just quite simply, may I ask what pronouns you use? And if it's something that bothers them, they'll tell you, know. Which leads me to the process of transitioning. Again, over and over I'm saying this is different for everybody. And this is a really big one that is different for every trans person. Some people will go on hormone replacement therapy, which is known as HRT, to help change their appearance. So for me, that helped to lower my voice. It brought on some facial hair. I'm almost 4 years on testosterone, and my cheeks are still like really sparse, and it's really frustrating because I'm 38, and people all the time are like, "Oh, you're like 25." Yeah, no. And beards are really in right now, you know, especially in the gay community. Like a lot of gay guys have that like really short beard, and I'm like at the gay beach, and I'm like, testosterone also has helped biologically. It changed like my fat patterns to be more masculine. It stopped my menstrual cycle, stuff like that. In the case of male to female, it also adjusts things like your body structure, hair production. Although once you start growing a beard, it's really hard to stop it. So I know less about that, you know, I'll be frank. I know less about the transition from male to female. But they do block testosterone, and they start injecting or taking like estrogen pills. That's for some people. Some people choose never to go on HRT. Some people can't for health reasons. And they'll go about more of a social transition. Some people have surgeries. Like I said, I had top surgery, which means that I had my breast tissue removed. I had a really good plastic surgeon, so you know, he kind of built like a really masculine chest for me. He put the incisions like under my pecs, and he did a really good job on my incisions. They're really, really like slight. Although it was a major surgery though, my incisions go from like the middle of my chest all the way under my armpits. Most, I would say, trans guys like me, they'll choose to bind their breasts right away to create that masculine appearance. Because again, people just sort of notice, maybe, the word's escaping me. Without thinking about it, like, come on, what's the word? Subconsciously, unconsciously, they'll just notice like your breast tissue. So even if you're dressed like in a shirt and tie, they'll notice like that you have breasts, and they'll gender you. So a lot of trans guys wear a binder. They're horrible. They're like spandex and lycra, and they jam your breast tissue down. But it really helps to get gendered properly. Surgery is really expensive, and it's not accessible to everybody, especially because you need all sorts of like documentation and letters and stuff to get trans surgery, as opposed to like wanting your nose done and you can just go in and like pay for it. So it's a really intense process. So it's not something a lot of guys can get, so they'll bind. As far as transitioning, most trans people will eventually choose a name that aligns with their preferred gender. So I started out, you know, I had the nickname Bear that was given to me because my birth name was like really, really feminine. And that just became my preferred name. You know, that's how I started introducing myself. Eventually, I did a legal name change, and it became my legal middle name. I chose a more normal first name for like business purposes and stuff like that, just for work. Like at work, I'm Nick, you know. And eventually, most people will seek to change their name legally, but that, again, is not always easy. It's becoming easier as we move forward, and it's becoming cheaper. But depending on where you live, it might be really expensive. So like mine in 2015 cost over $600 just for the application and court fees. And that's not even addressing like getting a change on your birth certificate, your passport, your social security, all of your insurance. I mean, it's a really intense process. But the most important thing to remember is that no matter how someone chooses to transition, their transition is valid. So again, in the case of a non-binary person, they might have a preferred name, they might bind, but they might never go on hormones, and that's completely valid. Again, a lot of non-binary people get a lot of flack for not being like trans enough. So, brings us to kind of the end. So how does one support trans people, including trans kids? Mostly this one just comes down to respect. When someone comes out, do your best to respect their wishes. Use their preferred name and pronouns. And yes, at the beginning, you are going to make mistakes. Apologize, correct yourself, move on. Don't make a scene. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. We don't want it. We don't want more attention. We just want to fit in. All right? Do not tell the person how hard it is to get their pronouns right. I guarantee you they are going through a harder phase than you are. Okay? Do not, I wrote it in like capitals, tell other people what a trans person's birth name is if you know it. It is our most closely guarded secret. We generally hate it, all right? It defines all that stuff that we hated about our body and our childhood and getting bullied and all those things, okay? Don't ask. If you know it, don't tell if somebody asks you, and let them know what I just said, right? If you need to refer to it at all, refer to it as birth name, never real name. My real name is Bear or Nick. It's never ever Nikki, okay? Don't ask about our genitals, all right? Unless it is something that comes up about, in a relationship, obviously you're gonna have to ask, but that's different, right? I had somebody ask me recently, we went out to dinner and I was like just talking about like my journey, and I said that I had had top surgery and how important that was to me and stuff like that. And I had just met this person like maybe a week before, and we were just having like casual like nachos. And he was like, oh, okay, well, what about below the belt? And it's like, okay, I said to him, I go, have we gotten that far in our like friendship that you're gonna ask me about my genitals? Should I ask you, like, if your left testicle hangs a little lower than your right one? It's a really insanely personal question, right? And to his credit, he was like, oh my God, I'm so ignorant. But you'd be surprised at how many people will just jump to asking me that question, and then ask, like, are you gonna have surgery and stuff like that? It's really, really personal. So unless you're really friendly with that person, just don't go there. Again, as far as supporting someone in their transition, we often need a lot of guidance on how to fulfill our new role. So we weren't allowed to wear certain things before, we weren't allowed to practice certain things, and a lot of us certainly didn't learn things from our parents. So for instance, clothing is really huge. If you are in a position to help someone go shopping, do it. Offer, right? If you see that somebody is kind of wearing like the same thing a lot, offer to take them shopping. A trans person can get easily overwhelmed with picking out new clothing. We don't know the rules, all right? Like what tie can I wear with what shirt, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of study that goes into this, and it can get really overwhelming when you try to go shopping and you're trying to put together like outfits and stuff like that. Paying for a whole new wardrobe is a massive undertaking as well. So I had friends who helped me a lot with this sort of thing. I started testosterone in the fall and realized not too long later that my winter jacket was a women's ski coat. And I was like kind of just layering hoodies, to avoid wearing that coat. Because I was starting to pass, and it was huge, but I knew, like, I'm gonna put on this women's jacket, and I'm not gonna pass, I'm gonna get misgendered, and like, so I mentioned it on Facebook, You know, like I didn't think about these things before I started my process. And a friend of mine who owns a military surplus store offered a discount on like new jacket and boots, you know, so that was huge. I also had friends who gave me clothing. So if you're in that position, you know, to help somebody shopping or with donations, you know, savvy shopping, like thrift stores are like my best friend. I love thrift stores. That's a huge way to support someone. Personal habits like shaving and grooming, right? Like I didn't learn from my dad how to shave my face. He did teach me how to tie a tie, which is cool. When I was like really little, I wanted to wear ties, you know? But yeah, like, again, I hit up Facebook and my ex actually helped me to shave my face for the first time. So, you know, a trans woman might want to shave her legs, you know? It's a learning process and you don't have that like parental guidance. So that's a huge help. Makeup, in the case of a trans woman, you know, there's great tutorials and stuff like that, but nothing is better than having someone go shopping with you and be like, oh, you're in autumn, you know, let's pick out your colors. Social support. Trans people can have a ton of social anxiety for so many reasons. Helping someone by simply joining them can be really huge. And that can be, you know, again, depending on the person, as much as just going to the mall, getting them out of the house, or going to like a bar or a club. I used to hate clubs and stuff like that because I wasn't comfortable with how people would approach me because of, you know, being female, and because of how people approach women. Like, come on. So when I transitioned, I was more comfortable with my body. I was more comfortable with approaching people or having people approach me. So I went to like a club for the first time in my life when I was like 35 years old, you know. But I did need that safety blanket. You know, I took friends with me and they helped to like buffer the people that were approaching me. So yeah, social support, you know, ask the person, how do you feel about this? Do you want to go there? Do you want somebody to go with you? And then in the case of, there's only 2 more points, guys, we're almost there. In the case of trans kids, they don't do a lot to medically transition until puberty, and then there's puberty blockers, there's HRT. So in the case of like a 6-year-old who tells you, you know, I feel like a boy, we transition them socially, you know. And some adults choose to do that as well, don't forget that, right? They just maybe cut their hair, you know. So for them, their hairstyle is often first. Clothing choices are key, you know, going and picking out, you know, masculine clothing. Letting them change their name at school is a really big one. And believe it or not, wearing a different style of underwear can be a huge change. That was one of my first steps way before I even knew I was trans, was I went out and I bought like men's underwear, and the days I wore it, like I knew I was wearing it. So you can definitely start there. You can definitely start with, well, wear this and see how you feel, you know. And if they like it, then that's an indicator that, you know, they're on the right path, right? And that's a good one for an adult that's questioning as well, you know. Pick out a little bra, you know, wear that under your clothes, see if it makes you feel good. And then for kids, again, we go back to their preferred name and everything like that. But again, the way we're addressing them is huge. So this is less the case for like an office environment, but maybe if you're dealing with a minor in the future, or if one of your kids or your niece or nephew comes out as trans, you know, think about what you're calling them. Again, little girls tend to be called, you know, sweetheart or honey or these like cute little words. You know, switch it up. Call them something different. Call them sport. Call them champ. You know, call them something more masculine, or the reverse. And then lastly, you know, for the workplace, remove your gendered titles, signage, stuff like that. So for instance, when I walked in here today, downstairs, you know, I asked to use the bathroom. Your downstairs bathrooms are family bathrooms or like all gender bathrooms, and I was like, oh, cool. But then I walked inside, and above the toilet, it says, please don't flush feminine hygiene products down the toilet. Well, just call it hygiene products. Lots of trans men still have like a period, you know, and it's awful. It is just a week of terrible dysphoria because it's your body reminding you, like, you're really this, you don't identify it as it. So that's a huge one. Just remove the word feminine, just put hygiene product, you know. So again, I would challenge you guys to just kind of look around and see, you know, how much how many things in not just in your workspace, but like in your world are gendered, you know, and start to maybe switch to more gender neutral, like I shouldn't refer to a group of people as guys, which I just did. I try to say folks when I walk up, like I'm a waiter, so if I'm passing hors d'oeuvres, like, and I walk up to a mixed group of people who are, you know, whatever, I'll walk up instead of saying like ladies and gentlemen or something like that, using gendered titles, I'll just say folks, you know. So yeah, that's it as far as my lecture. Hopefully you're all still awake. Hopefully you don't need another donut or maybe you need some coffee. Thanks for listening. And should we do some Q&A?
Yeah.
Cool.
Hi, Nick. I just had a quick question. When it comes to media, for instance, the movie Boys Don't Cry, how it was not portrayed by it's portrayed by a woman who is, transitioning into Brandon and everything else. I just want to know what your general outlook upon that movie or movies like that.
So I actually haven't seen Boys Don't Cry because I know how it ends, and it's just too painful. But I do know the story, obviously, of Brandon Tina. The movie doesn't portray him perfectly as per his actual personality. They kind of like, well, again, I haven't seen it. I'm going on rumor, but I haven't seen it. As far as like getting trans actors to play trans roles, I think that is the next step forward. You know, I can understand why we didn't do that in the past, and why a female was chosen for that role, but I think it's really time to step up. We have enough trans people out there auditioning for stuff that it's really time to seek out said people for those roles. Yeah, and in fact, Scarlett Johansson was just recently cast as a trans man, and it was a really bad miscasting too. She doesn't look anything like that person. And there was a huge outpouring of protest, and she actually stepped down from the role. So I'm glad. I hope they still make the movie, and I hope that they get an actual trans man to play him. So thanks. Good question.
Morning.
Morning.
In terms of your, first of all, thank you for sharing. I learned a lot. In terms of your transition, how did your family and friends respond, and were they supportive?
Mixed. You know, again, it wasn't a huge surprise to most people that I knew. You know, I had cut my hair off when I was like 19, so you're talking about 1999, and again, I came out in 2014 as trans. So I was really gender nonconforming. And I got a lot of crap for it. Like people say really mean and hurtful things, like why don't you try dressing like a woman? And so for me, people who were going to be put off by it as far as like socially, so like in the martial arts dojo and stuff like that, they were already like not interested in being around me. I did lose a couple people, which was surprising. People will object to it for like religious reasons. I've been told that I'm spitting in God's face by choosing to transition. That hurt. I lost a good friend and mentor who just completely blocked me out and never explained why. That's even more painful. But it was really not a lot of people. Most people embraced it. They were like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Or they already kind of like had asked me, like, how do you like to be referred to? As far as my family, I think family is the hardest, because they've known you for so long as your original like gender and by your birth name and stuff like that. So obviously family takes the longest. They say to give most people about 6 months to make the adjustment as far as like your preferred name and pronouns, and for family give them 2 years. So it's really not easy. There's ups and downs. There's, there's difficult conversations, as far as like, wow, you moved really fast on this, because I only came out when I was ready to actually like start testosterone and stuff like that. and then there's really positive conversations, people that, an aunt just called me up one day that I hadn't spoken to in years. She saw it on Facebook, and she was like, yeah, so I approached some of my gay colleagues, and I said, my niece wants to be called Nicholas now, what do I do, and that was a great conversation. So it can go both ways, and it went both ways for me too. Great question. You want to follow up? Yeah.
And then a follow-up question, because I know definitely in the African American community, religion plays a big role, and it's just like, you need to pray that away.
Yeah.
Was that something that came up for you as well?
My relationship with religion is more complicated, but I have had religious people say that to me. Again, I was told, you're spitting in God's face, God made you this way. My belief is that God did make me this way, and God doesn't make mistakes. He put a really difficult path in front of me. I could continue to live a very painful lie, or I could go through this really painful path and come out of it stronger. I wasn't really raised super religious. I had gotten into religion in my later teens, early 20s, and I kind of walked away from it because of that community's outlook, and again, I was starting to be more gender non-conforming, and I was being told no, you need to wear skirts and stuff like that, as a Jewish female. You're expected to dress a certain way, you're supposed to sit on a certain side of the synagogue. And so I had to leave that path for a while and kind of go on a side quest and do my transition. And now actually I'm getting back to religion. And yeah, I think that as difficult as this journey was, it wasn't an accident, and furthermore, not only did God make me transgender, but God gave me a personality, and a quite gregarious personality. I like to hear myself speak. And so, that led me here to you guys today, right? And I don't think that those two things are a mistake. So I hope I answered your question.
You did.
Good, okay. Ooh, lots of hands.
Good morning. You said it's okay to kind of assume someone's gender based on their appearance, but I wonder if you could address this question. If you're not sure and you ask permission, I worry that some people might be offended.
It can offend somebody. It is a delicate conversation to enter into, but as far as assuming someone's gender, I look at you and I'm like, okay, you identify as male, just based on your haircut, your shirt, and stuff like that, But as far as asking someone's pronouns or assuming someone's gender, everybody's different, and there are people who do get pissed off by you're presenting very masculinely today, but you might be non-binary, you might be gender fluid, and so if I call you he, or if I say sir, you might be like, well, you're assuming my gender, Well, at that point, I would put it on you to educate me, So that's a little bit of a touchy thing. But as far as again, asking someone's pronouns, I've done it. I've met someone who was just less unambiguously masculine or feminine. They had the body structure of a male, but presented more effeminately as far as their clothing. They were wearing a cardigan to work often. I noticed that their nails were painted and they wore earrings in both ears, which again, these things shouldn't be inherently gendered, but they are. And so I just said, is it okay if I ask you what your pronouns are? Again, giving that person the out that, no, it's not okay to ask me, and I don't want to have that conversation right now. And then giving them the opportunity to say, yes, it's okay, and I prefer, in that case, they were gender fluid, and they said, I like they, them. So it's a delicate conversation. I would definitely choose the right place and time, lead into that conversation. Don't come to somebody's cubicle and be like, pronouns, how's your day going, stuff like that, and find out if it's a good time to have that conversation, So yeah, thanks, good question.
Thank you.
Scott.
Hey, yeah. this is Scott. So recently I was helping, or trying to help, a trans male with a disability who was in the emergency room. And they had not changed their name legally to their preferred current name. And so it was very difficult for me to find a comfort zone with myself, it just makes it about me at that point, but trying to help this person and get access to them, because the emergency room, the healthcare system wasn't going to let me do that if I didn't know their legal name. So there's a lot of healthcare advocates in here. I'm wondering, in that kind of a crisis situation, and I assume part of the answer is going to be it's going to be different for everybody, but what can we do as healthcare advocates to support folks?
And again, you said that they had not changed their name legally?
They had not.
Had they come out, though? Did they have a preferred name?
Yes.
So they would be comfortable with you using that? Okay. So that, I think, is a matter of, again, communication. You know, telling the staff, you know, I'm here to advocate for this person. Their legal name is such, and then their preferred name is this. And asking them to put that on their like little wristband thingy or somewhere in a chart, or even like most hospitals will have something on the wall like a whiteboard, you know. So communication, and then yeah.
Well, so my concern at that point though becomes I'm outing the person without their consent. So they're in crisis mode.
Right. Okay. It's a tough call. It really is a tough call. You are outing them. If it was me, honestly, if you were taking me to the emergency room, like I took you to the emergency room, I saved Scott's life 2 weeks ago. Yeah, if you were taking me to the emergency room, I would want you to tell them, you know, that my friend Bear is a trans male, because let's say they have to cut my clothes off. You know, they're gonna see my scars, they're gonna see my body. You know, it could be something inherently related to, you know, my anatomy. You know. So I would want you to say something, you know. If you are a healthcare advocate dealing with a trans person, I think that's a conversation that you should have before crisis mode, quite frankly. You know, if there's a case that you may have to take that person to the emergency room when they're unconscious, have that conversation prior. You know, and maybe that should be part of your intake. Maybe your intake forms need to get updated, you know, to more trans inclusivity, maybe a word. Look it up, Google it quick. It should be on there anyway, and that's one of the things I can't stand about health intake forms. As a side note, is it asks your gender and it just says like male, female. Well, why isn't there a space for me to answer trans male? Exactly. You know, it's really important, right? Because I have my original reproductive organs. You know, so what if I'm having a ruptured cyst or something on my ovary? You know, and that's what sent me to the emergency room, like, unconscious. Like, they need to know that. It's really important. You know, so why isn't that on your intake form anyway? But yeah, if you're going to be advocating for somebody, I would say that's a conversation to have, like, early on. Good question, though.
Hi, thank you again for sharing your story. So I just had a question. I've had a friend who she's like a scientist, right, by trade. And so she and I have argued a lot about
scientists.
Yes, right? And so that's why I'm just a little bit like, what do you say to the naysayers who are saying, you know, she's done whatever research she's done related to, trans surgeries, they're unsafe, there's complications. And I'm like, or there's only 2 sexes, you know, and so I'm just like, but I've read other things, you know, so I guess what would you say to those naysayers? I'm sure you've done tons of research related to this.
Totally. Good question. So you have 2 kinds of naysayers. You have educated ones and you have ignorant ones, right? So you have people that have not gone beyond like an 8th grade biology lesson, and they want to get in your face and say like, what? XX is this and XY is that. Okay. So to them, I throw out all those intersex things that I mentioned before. Okay, what about XXY? What about X partial X? You know, they go through puberty differently. There are all sorts of different chromosomal combinations. I know of at least half a dozen. So I would put that there first. I would throw your research at them. Go and do some research. But that's, like I said, the kind of the more ignorant naysayers.
So she's a doctoral student?
She's a doctor,
So
yeah.
I've said this to her before.
Yeah.
I've like said, look, read this article, like there's not just XXY, or there's all these different manifestations of the chromosomes, so I guess.
And what did she say?
She just says that, no, that's not really true. I'm like, but.
So she said your proof that you're presenting to her, as a scientist, she said the proof that you're presenting to her is bullshit.
Right.
Well, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
And at that point, that person has gone beyond research and fact into opinion, and you're not going to convince that person. And so I do engage sometimes, and I do attempt to educate, and then there's a certain point where I go, okay, you're not interested in the education that I'm offering you, and I walk away. And if that was a person in my personal life, I would really walk away from them. If it's somebody you have to deal with as far as work and stuff like that, that's really tough, and you're obviously going to have to continue to work with that person. In my case, as the actual trans person, that person would be on thin ice because they're coming close to an HR report, and it's a matter of not sharing opinions in the workplace and just moving on with, well, this is how the world deals with it right now. And so you're gonna have to, whether you agree with it or not, you have to update like how you are going through life and how you're referring to somebody, and make sure to keep it like professional. So yeah, great question.
Jackie, and then Brittany.
Hey, this is Jackie. Right here.
Like, all right.
Yeah. Could you please clarify for me again, binary and non-binary?
Okay, so as far as binary and non-binary, again, think about gender just as a spectrum, okay? And on one side of it, you have someone who was assigned male at birth because they were born with certain reproductive organs that were visible, and they identify as male, all right? So that's a cisgender male, and they have no question. They don't want to do anything effeminate. They're like, man, right? I don't ask directions, all right? And then on the other side, you have someone who identifies as female, and there's just no ambiguity to it. So those are your binary points, right? So as a trans person, I was assigned one, and I identify as the other. So I crossed all the way over, and I identify very strongly as male, although I do stop and ask for directions, just so you know. I have the experiences of having been treated not well as a woman, and so I'm much more like open to how to address a woman, or personal space in public, stuff like that. So I am a binary trans male. I went from one to the other, and I'm very happy being strongly male. And then in between the two, you have all these points where they don't align unambiguously. So you might have someone who identifies as male and doesn't want to transition or start hormones or anything like that, but they also really enjoy, presenting a little bit more like challenging to the idea of gender norms. Like, no, I'm gonna wear, some lipstick, or I'm going to, wear like more female looking tops, because they are very different, right? Their cut is different, So that person would be considered non-binary, or may consider themselves non-binary. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, did that clarify for you? Cool.
Hi, I'm Mary.
Hi.
I just wanted to say thank you for doing what you do. It is extremely powerful, and I hope that you one day realize that whatever pain that you still have, by just the education and showing up like this and doing what many don't do, is more than you'll know. I fell into the role of managing 300 volunteers at an LGBTQ center once a grant that I originally was hired for fell through. So I used to do a 2.5-hour training for the volunteers. And so you're dead on. And there are a couple of things I just wanted to say, like, people get hung up on asking pronouns. It is quite all right to err on the side of wrong and goodness. But the main thing I would teach the volunteers, and Ken, you put this on my mind, was ask people their names.
Yeah.
We want to be recognized more than anything. And you can call them he, she, it, whatever, but it is definitely self-affirming if you use someone's name.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so, again, thank you.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that. And I think you're right. You know, like getting out here and doing this and educating people, it helps me. You know, it is a healing process for me. And it makes me feel better knowing that you might know somebody whose time is going to be maybe a little bit easier than mine because I came here today. You know, so yeah, it is kind of like it's not really a Band-Aid, but it's definitely like it's healing something inside of me. So yeah, thank you. And as far as your name, yeah, like yeah, that's the biggest thing, right? You don't necessarily need to refer to somebody by their pronouns. Like you can skip it and just say like, this is my friend Bear, and Bear would like, you know, a tall coffee with some almond milk. Right? You know, but yeah, really, really good point. By the way, like, we have a sign language interpreter in the room, and I recently created my new name sign, so can I share it with you? Okay, so the ASL, and correct me if I'm wrong, the ASL sign for bear is...
That's correct.
Yay! So when I introduce myself as Bear, it's not like your average name, and so people will be like, oh, Barry? Which is just awful. I'm like, no. So I started doing this. I'm like, Bear, grr. So because my first name that I chose is Nicholas, I decided my name sign would be N Bear. And I don't know, I'm like super excited about that.
We have time for about 2 more questions.
Okay.
Andrea, I think, has the mic right now.
Yes, I was just wondering if there were any support systems that were really helpful to you, or someone you would point people to, or just in general how the support systems are. Do they need work? Are they okay?
So I never went to any like real life support groups, mostly because of time constraint issues. They took place during times that I wasn't available. But we live in this really awesome age of the internet. And so I, very early on, I joined Susan's Place, which is a transgender support forum. And you can go on there and find answers. You can search stuff and it'll lead you to, results on like what will testosterone do to me, stuff like that. You can post questions. So that was a really good start. And then I'm also like a heavy Facebook addict. And so like I can't, God, every time I open my phone, like I hit the Facebook thing and I'm like, I didn't even want to go on Facebook. But there are tons of support groups there as well. The biggest one being the Facebook Transgender Alliance, and they do allow allies, and they quite welcome allies. So if you are a trans ally, that's a good one to join. If you're curious about things, be careful about how you ask things, be careful about how you address the group. No gendered terms, period. And then they have like really specific groups as well. So like I'm an admin for FTM Trans Support. So that means that I moderate comments and stuff all day, which is just a huge job, and I wish I got paid for it. But then like right down to, top surgery or hysterectomies or anything like that. Like if you go and search, it's there. So I use that a lot. I never went to any like actual support groups, but they are out there, and it's really just a Google search away. Or you can call up therapists. Live Oak is a really gender supportive group in Chicago, so you can call up Live Oak and ask them about their support groups, and ask them about like online resources as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have one more question?
Last question. Hi.
Hi, my name is Butch. I'm curious about something. Folks who are not familiar with the transgender world, maybe they, grew up in a certain environment, or they're just completely clueless about that. how do you share with them who you are and your journey as a transgender person?
It's always a really heavy conversation. This happens to me a lot. Like at work, I work with a lot of people who just have never met a trans person before. And so when it is pertinent to the conversation, I will bring it up. You know, if they say something that may be like offensive, you know, or they make a joke or something like that, I might bring it up. And it's just a conversation that I approach when I have time to educate them. And I approach it very, very cautiously. And from the point of view that I know that they're going to ask me difficult questions or ignorant questions. And I just give time. I just give time for that, you know. And I do want people to know about it, so I think it's important to share with somebody. Yeah. I hope that made sense. I felt a little rambly.
It
So,
does.
yeah, thanks. Thank you.
All right, thank you very, very much. That means over, everybody.